Muslims call this Jahiliyyah, which is the time of ignorance. But we need to talk about Arabia and its surroundings before we eventually talk about Quran, Muhammad, its theology, its implications, and so on and so forth. So let's jump right into it. So Arabia is pretty much a quadrilateral plateau, and it starts to rise east to west. And on the western side, of course, much of it's desert. But on the western side, that's the spine of mountains. That's the Hijaz area. That's where you would have Mecca taking two caravan trade routes, going once up north to Syria and one down south to Yemen every year, because Mecca couldn't really grow anything based on the Kaaba to get its money and trade. There might have been some gold mines in and around right before Muhammad's time and during Muhammad's time, also with trades for leather, gold, frankincense, myrrh might have came through the area. We're not going to talk about the revisionists of Patricia Crone that said that Mecca would have never been on a trade route and people would have went to Ta'if instead. Those questions will come much later. So we're just taking right now the standard Islamic narrative. And the reason why there are revisionist narratives is because a lot of your sources for the Quran, for Quranic history, Muhammad history, and so on and so forth, doesn't come till, say, the biography of Muhammad, the Surat Rasul Muhammad, the prophet of Allah. The Surat Rasul Allah, which is biography of Muhammad, written by Ibn Ishaq, one of the first ones. Ibn Ishaq died 767, 150 years after Muhammad died. And only part of that gets into edited version of biography by Ibn Hisham. Years later, Ibn Hisham never met Ibn Ishaq. And so a lot of these hadith, which you use, that are oral reports of Quran. Sorry out there, those are my kids yelling and screaming. Hopefully other videos I will not have that going on, but you know, what can I do at this point? So hadith come a couple hundred years later, the sayings, the words, the actions of Muhammad. So that's what you use for Sharia law. Quran, the biography of Muhammad, and hadith. These are used for Islamic school of jurisprudence, and there's predominantly four schools. We'll get into that later. But right now, let's just talk about the history of the area of Saudi Arabia. So if you go in western Saudi Arabia along the Hijaz, and you go, 25 miles or so to the east of the Red Sea, you get into Mecca. And then about 210 miles to the north, you end up to Yathrib. That's where the Hijra in roughly 622, where Muhammad immigrated there. That's where the start of the Islamic calendar begins. But for today, we just want to talk about the players in and around Saudi Arabia. So you have Byzantine Empire, which pretty much Roman Empire. The Roman Empire moved there under Constantine in the 4th century. And it lasted all the way up until 1453, and they themselves did not call them Byzantine; they called themselves Romans. And Greek speaking there, lots of Greek. Hellenization still very big there. And they struggled with the Sasanian Empire. Some people call it the Sasanian, but for me, I like to call it Sasanian Empire, which is pretty much Iran and Iraq as well, but modern day Iran. This is eventually the Persian Empire. And they fought with the Byzantine Empire for about hundreds of years, for about 500 years roughly, more or less. And they also had in between there, because Byzantine Empire is in the Anatolia, modern day Turkey. In between there, if you go to northwest Saudi Arabia into more Syria area, even into Israel more or less, that's where you get the Ghassanids, or some people call them the Japhnids, and they sometimes fought with Byzantine and against the Lakhmids to the east, and the Sassanians to the east as well. So sometimes there's a proxy war going on between Byzantines and Sassanians, between the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids fighting each other. And sometimes Byzantines and Sassanians fought directly against each other. So the time we want to talk about is about 40 years, especially before the rise of Muhammad, before his supposed birth. Justinian, the Emperor Justinian, about 527, 565, he actually reconquered parts of the West because the Roman Empire fell in about 476. And he kind of reconquered it to some degree. And so he rebuilt the Hagia Sophia. But as he rebuilt the West, one of the problems that plagued him was actually a plague. And so this was a big part to weaken them. But as he started to rebuild the West of the Roman Empire to some degree, the Sassanians saw it, and because he went over here, they came in and they also weakened the Byzantine Empire. So that's kind of interesting. But Justinian, he's very interesting because in 554, basically he had a Christian universal edict to try to establish Christianity more or less universally. That was kind of his edict or his goal. But yeah, Justinian's general Belisarius, he helped reestablish part of the West. He built great buildings, taxation. But yeah, this was a big part of fighting the Sassanians over time. One of the reasons for the Byzantines to not be invaded, they had the big Theodosian walls to defend them. And also they were situated in Turkey, which gets pretty cold up there. And the Arabians, and several times throughout the history, more than several times throughout the history, when they tried to siege Constantinople, sometimes the weather helped the Byzantines to escape the Arabs or the Islamic Arab invasion. So that's general there. We can talk more about that later. Some of the things there. Something else keep in mind, the Council of Ephesus, 431. Nestorian ideology was seen as heretical, so those people were scattered. Some of them scattered out, especially into the Lakhmids area, northeast Arabia and southern Iraq, and there were Jews living there. There were Nestorians living there, and even some Manichaeans living there. Manichaeanism, with the false prophet Mani, arose in the 3rd century, and it really flourished from about 300 to 500. Remnants of it can be felt into the 13th century, even into parts of China. But especially 300 to 500, Mani, which is basically neo-Gnosticism with eclectic religions, throwing all these other prophets before him. And Mani really didn't have much new to say. He was just really a compiler of other religions, and then called himself the seal of the prophets. And that's very, very similar a pattern of Muhammad took, a compilation of Judaism, Christianity, Zoroastrianism, and other religions. And Muhammad was not an original guy. He was a compiler of other religions, a pragmatic person, and we'll talk more about that in other videos. So anyways, you had, with the Ghassanids, sometimes called the Japhnids, they were a buffer zone between the Arabians and the Byzantines, okay? And they were not very Chalcedonian in their Christology. That was a problem. But their empire was relatively stable, lasted from 3rd to 7th century. But they were important for the trade routes. People in modern-day Ramallah today say they come from the Arab tribe of Ghassaniya, supposedly. Their capital was Jahiliyyah, which is modern-day Golan Heights. Supposedly they originated all the way from parts of Yathrib in Yemen, so from Arabia. They had a king, Al-Harith, from 530 to 570, so he was contemporary of Justinian. But they had many kings to show that they had a pretty strong stability there. And they sent missionaries into Arabia, and they had in the Ghassanid courts. They were not like Arabs in the sense they were very sedentary. They were not very nomadic. Okay, and their Ghassanid courts is very big for Arabic poetry. And once again, they fought against the Lakhmids. The Lakhmids' capital, which would be the east of the Ghassanids, that was a buffer zone for the Lakhmids, buffer zone between Arabia and Sasanian Empire. Their capital was Ahira, also from about the 3rd to 7th century, but their history is tougher to pin down. But for the most part, they were allies of the Sassanians. And their location from Ahira all the way down to Yamama, so all the way down to much of eastern Arabia. And eventually Musaylima, which is a heretic contemporary of Muhammad, he and his people also fought Muslims at the Battle of Yamama. But Muhammad was already dead. This was under Abu Bakr, under the Rida Wars, or the Wars of Apostate. And we'll talk about that later. But under the Battle of Dikar, which is around 607, 608, more or less, in there, the Sassanians lose Eastern Arabia. So, because of the Sassanians and Byzantine fighting each other for over 500 years, taxation, plague, fighting each other, this weakened the empire. So, Islam was ripe. Islam was ripe for the taking to go into these countries and to really flourish. Because up until that time, Arabia was never really invaded by anyone, nor did Arabia invade anyone up until this time. So, who would really want to invade Arabia? Because it's pretty much a desert. There's no, for the most part, there's nothing there. It costs more to keep Arabia intact than from the benefit that you get out of Arabia. So those are things you have to keep in mind. But Imran al-Qays, don't confuse him with the poet that may have influenced Muhammad to some degree. But Imran al-Qays of the Lakhmids, he wanted to unify and be an independent Arabian kingdom. So maybe he was some sort of quasi-vision for Muhammad. But Muhammad's view was predominantly more than pan-Arabian nationalism. It was more based on religion, I would argue. I agree with Fred Donner and his thesis with regarding to that, based on what the Quran says. If we use the Quran as a template, as a motive, although did Muhammad have ulterior motives? Of course, given his wives and his, aberrant theology, which we'll talk about later. But to some degree, he might have started out fairly concerned with theology and where he was going to go in the Day of Judgment. Because in Muhammad's day, Jews, Christians, there was a lot of, to some degree, there was some asceticism in and around Arabia, Syria, Egypt, desert fathers, monks, and so forth. No doubt about that. So asceticism was there. But also apocalypticism. The Day of Judgment is coming, or the rise of the Messiah for Jews to Israel will push back against the Byzantine Empire, and the Messiah will come. Judeo-Christian, in that time, there was a lot of apocalypticism. And even in the Quran, that apocalypticism, a lot of people don't know about, is there. And we'll talk about that theology in the future. So yeah, and Al-Hira is also, which is the pretty much the capital for the Lakhmids. This is right near modern day Kufa. All right, Kufa. And so with the Sasanian Empire, they had a debate whether they were actually dualists because of Zoroastrianism, or whether they were actually monotheism because of Zurvanism. Some people say that Zurvanism is actually monotheism, and the dualism that is emanating from the monotheism is based on Angra Manu and Ahura Mazda. And we won't get into that right now. But because of the universal rule of kings within Zoroastrianism, this is kind of seen as a direct way that the Sasanian empires said that they wanted to have universal rule. So you have over here Justinian, his 550 4 edict of universal rule for Christendom, and you have over here Zoroastrianism that sees kind of a divine right for kings to rule and for their religion to be set up, and that these kings represent Ahura Mazda. And there were, again, going back to people living under this Zoroastrianism, again, many Jews, Nestorians living there. Sometimes Nestorians were persecuted, sometimes they weren't. Even the Sassanians allowed, obviously because of this, they allowed other religions to more or less have their freedom. Not always, but more or less they did. Khosrow I, one of his sons, became a Christian. Khosrow I and Khosrow II were very powerful Sasanian rulers in the 6th century. All right, so the religion and political warriors were the top of the Zoroastrian society, and this was reinforced by the Zoroastrian fire temples because certain societal groups had to be at these fire temples, and if you were at this lower end of the societal hierarchy, you could not go to this fire temple. So these fire temples reinforced societal groups within Zoroastrianism. And so Manichaeanism tried to make more equity and got some support from within Sasanian Empire. But there was a time that the Sassanians did seize Antioch, and they wanted to push into Anatolia. This is under the emperor. This was actually under when Heraclius was reigning, and Heraclius, unbelievable comeback because he had a 180, where eventually in Jerusalem in 614, a part of the supposed true cross was taken into more or less the capital there of Sassanians, which is Ctesiphon. And about a decade later, there was an unexpected raid by Heraclius on Ctesiphon that got Khosrow basically kicked out, and his son took over. But he restored, about a decade after 614, more or less, he restored a relic of the true cross, which is interesting because from the perspective of the Jews, when the Sassanians pushed back and stole a relic of the true cross, they thought, oh, this is going to be time the Messiah is going to come in, the Byzantines are going to be under our feet. And then not too long, there was a reversal. Jews had those visions go out. So whether you're modern day Christians looking at experiences for eschatological things that happen, or whether you're Jews 1400 years ago looking at experience for eschatological things to come, don't. Stick with scripture. And so the Byzantine pushed back because they came into Ctesiphon and they got all their old lands back. They got Assyria back, they got Egypt back. So that was really, really amazing. But yeah, Khosrow I from about 540 to 580, he was contemporary with Justinian. He was pretty rational with regards to his taxation. I believe he also captured Petra. But he did break a treaty with Justinian and sacked Antioch and got quite a bit of money. But the Sassanians eventually, in 570, took control of Yemen. So this is very important. So Yemen is at the southern part of modern day Arabia, where there's been a civil war between Sunnis and Shiites for over a decade now. Won't get into that right now, but that's been going on. But this is very important because up until about the 4th century, Yemen was pretty much polytheist, and so eventually they became pretty much Jewish monotheism, and then over time, because of the Red Sea location and because of where Yemen was located, people would bring stuff in from the east, from India, through there, and then that could be pushed up to the north through the Hijaz, that could be pushed west over the Red Sea, that could be pushed into Ethiopia, could come into the port of Adulis, which was important for Byzantine port, because Aksum, the kingdom of Aksum, which is modern day Ethiopia, became Christian, and they were pretty much allianced with the Byzantines, and so that was very important there as well. But Yemen had shrines. This is before the rise of Islam. Yemen had shrines that were considered sacred, places where you should not fight, just like the Kaaba. You're not supposed to fight there. So if you're not to fight there, where the Kaaba is, in the Arabian pantheon of gods, this is also good for business deals. And again, the Arabian pantheon of gods and the Kaaba was also good for trading, because the Muslims were reliant upon trade for their survival. And there were, during Muhammad's time, even though we haven't got to Muhammad yet, we're not even going to talk about Muhammad. Muhammad was supposedly born in 570. But in Muhammad's day, there were supposedly other Arabian prophets in Muhammad's time. But I want to get back to Yemen real quick. So in the Red Sea, Byzantine, Axumite, modern-day Ethiopia, shipping port of Atlas was very important because right before Muhammad was born, there was a militant Jew, Du knew us, and he slaughtered Christians, and for no other reason. Byzantine might have wanted it just so Sassanians didn't have it. Sassanians wanted it just so Byzantines didn't want it. Although Sassanians took the port of Yemen, they could almost have a monopoly there of shipping coming in from the east, seize taxes, and Byzantines got to pay them boohoo bucks. So this would be nice for the Byzantines to take this port here in Yemen. And eventually, after Nuwas died, he died. People from Ethiopia came over and eventually fought him, and he died. And for a small time, Christians had control of Yemen under Abraham. And with this being said, eventually Abraham supposedly brought a bunch of elephants and was trying to raid the Kaaba. And supposedly, one of the chapters in the Quran, which is supposedly about this is supposedly the year of the elephant. This is supposedly the year of Muhammad's birth. The birds dropped stones, and Abraham and his men were hit, and they had to leave, and they never could do any damage to the Kaaba. And that was seen as one of Allah's ways to protect the Kaaba from Christian destruction, supposedly. Okay, anyways, so about the 570s, by the time Muhammad is born, and 598 also reestablished, but 570, 598, Sassanians took control of Yemen. So you have a lot of political jostling going on there with Byzantine, Sassanians, the buffer zones between the Ghassanids and the Lakhmids, the routes that was controlled by the Ghassanids, because even their routes would extend all the way down to Yathrib, which is where Muhammad went for the Hijrah from Mecca to Yathrib in 622. So that's very important there. And then, of course, the asceticism. Muhammad went to caves to pray, which we'll talk about. Zayd ibn Amir, who was one of the Hanif, was also found at the cave of light, in the mountain of light, Mountain Al-Nur. This is supposedly where Muhammad eventually got his first revelation, the cave of Hira, supposedly 610. But before that, there was a guy that was pretty much ascetic, Zayd ibn Amir, 605 or so, roughly. He died, and then not too long after that, Muhammad supposedly gets revelations. But Muhammad would have trade vans going up through the Hijaz with his uncle, who never became a believer, Abu Talib. He would have saw all kinds of stuff from asceticism, variant Christianities, eventually would have ran into Jews, and so forth and so on. And we'll talk more about all that stuff in depth. We have many videos to make, and so this is very important to understand, because the last thing I'll say with Yathrib, it's an oasis town. Lots of Jews supposedly there. People that knew how to make date palms, dates, lived in a watery source, and so Muhammad supposedly came and was supposedly invited in 622 as kind of an intermediator between some of the people that were having arguments. And anyways, we'll get to all that later. So anyways, these are some of the things happening in and around Muhammad's day in late antiquity, as it's commonly known as. We just touched on a few things. If you have any questions or comments, please let us know. But this is just the context to understand where Muhammad was coming from, his mindset. Muhammad in his day, there were in Arabia there were Jews, there was some Orthodox Christians, heretical Christians, maybe a remnant of Gnosticism or even Mandaeans who were followers of John the Baptist. There was Zoroastrianism, there were Manichaeans, various sects of Judaism, it appears even. So this whole eclectic, if you wanted to not be persecuted, if you also, there's polytheism going on in Muhammad's day, if you wanted to be confused about religions, Arabia, the only game in town. The only game in town as far as so many religions. I mean, yeah, you can say, under the Ahmeds, there's a lot of, Judaism, Christianism, Zoroastrianism, Manichaeanism there. But those people would be more representative, more robust of their views. Yeah, there'd be arguments, polemics, apologetics going on. But there would be more mainstream views there. Here, within the Hijaz, you would find minority views within minority views. And the Quran sometimes presumes, within the context of the surahs, of the chapters, presumes arguments with these groups. And these very minority groups within minority groups happening. So we'll talk more about that in other videos. Anyways, thank you for listening. If you have any questions, let us know.